This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good afternoon, this is Tech Talk. I'm Jeff Sandhu. So cyber attacks are hugely popular these days, and we love hearing real life stories about all this. So we brought back Krishna Rajagopal, the CEO of AKATI Consulting, to tell us about cyber warfare for today's episode. So first, tell me, what do you mean by cyber warfare? You know, this is not some game you created in your mind, right?
Hi, Jeff. Well, it's good to be back. Now, if you look at cyber warfare, right, if you look at the definition, it's actually any kind of politically motivated hacking, right? The aim is, of course, to sabotage or for even espionage. Another definition, of course, some people call cyber warfare as information warfare, right? It can also be defined as a action by a nation state to penetrate another nation's computer or a network, right? For the purpose of either causing damage, disruption, or espionage. So I wish I created this in my head, but unfortunately, no.
So why did you pick this topic? Is this something that, you know, you've been watching a lot of movies recently since we last spoke, you know? So all this cyber warfare seems a bit too Hollywood in a way.
Well, I love watching movies, but then, of course, you know, Jeff, I'm sure you heard of Stuxnet.
Yes.
You know, recently there was a New York Times report that came out that stated that there was a Operations Olympic Games, right? And this Operations Olympic Games was actually conceptualized, started, and created by the United States government, right? And the end product of this operation was Stuxnet.
Wow.
And I quote something from the report. It was initially embarked upon in 2006. Without much enthusiasm, as a preferable alternative to withdrawing objections against an Israeli airstrike against Iran's nuclear facilities, unquote. Right? Personally, of course, I think it's because of the last blunder that was done during Bush, you know, especially with the Iraq War, the whole weapons of mass destruction fairy tale. So, you know, everyone is going to be a little skeptical if the US went around saying that somebody had nuclear weapons again. So they had to resort to a more silent, obscure manner of evidence collection. So it looks very Hollywoodish, but unfortunately it's not.
So there's nothing that an average user like me and you know, should be worried about. Well, you're not really an average user, but, you know, for me, mostly, and you know, are these just for, you know, military and government officials, right?
Well, you know, Jeff, imagine this, right? Kaspersky did a little study recently, and they found out that, you know, users like you and me browsing the internet face an average of about 108,000 attacks a day. That's pretty much 1,800 attacks a minute. And these criminals actually used almost about 4 million domains that were registered just for this crime in 2011. Now, having said that, right, imagine if your television networks are jammed, taken over. Radio stations, maybe BFM, is jammed or hijacked. Logistic networks are disabled. Your enemy communication network is disabled, or your stock exchange data being infiltrated or manipulated, right? These things sound a little scary, right? So unfortunately, it is something that everybody should be worried about.
So, you know, what are some of the common forms of, you know, cyber warfare?
Well, if you put it in a nutshell, well, you have vandalism, propaganda, denial of service or distributed denial of service, network and non-network attacks. But the main ultimate aim seems to be to steal potential juicy information. Now, going back to the history, the first ever cyber warfare that we actually saw was in the first Iraq war, right? It was during that time that the Dutch hackers sort of broke in to the US Department of Defense computers, and they stole the US troop movement data. And they actually went to sell it to the Iraqis. But unfortunately, Iraqis thought that this was hoax, and they turned it down. You know, they must have regretted later. You know, and then of course we had that famous Project Aurora. I think we even had a whole show about it, where Google was attacked in China. Then China Telecommunications hijacked almost 15% of the world's network. They said it was an accident. Exxon, Conoco, Marathon, Oil, all these were attacked. Then we started seeing some serious attempts. For example, there was a spy network called GhostNet, which used servers that claimed that they were from China. And this basically tapped into classified documents from 103 countries. If you're wondering, Malaysia's in there, yes, we are part of the statistics. Yeah. And of course, China denies the claim. Then we came to the whole Iran fiasco. Now, in between of this, we actually had a personal experience. We saw a series of attacks that were targeted against South Korea and some US organizations. And of course, when you mention the word South Korea, everybody will say North Korea. They must have done it, right? But unfortunately, when we traced it, it came back to UK. Right? And in the case of Iran, with this whole Stuxnet thing, the Stuxnet worm was sort of one of the most advanced piece of malware that was ever discovered at that point in time. And basically, this whole Stuxnet fiasco sort of increased the profile of cyber warfare attacks. Then we had Duku as well as Flame. So it's a serious problem, and it's something that is becoming ever increasing popular.
Right, and in just a moment I'll be asking Krishna Rajagopal, CEO of AKATI Consulting, about Flame and Duku. I think you just mentioned it a bit earlier. And it is going to be very interesting. Storytelling time next on BFM 89.9. Jeff Sandhu here, and with me today is my master Sifu, Krishna Rajagopal, CEO of AKATI Consulting. We are talking about cyber warfare now. You know, some of us don't really know the infamous Stuxnet virus. Now, you know, then came along Flame and Doku. You just mentioned it. Now, you know, before we actually start about, you know, talking about what exactly happened with these two Flame and Doku viruses, you know, is it another version of Stuxnet?
Yeah. See, what happened was this. Actually, when Stuxnet came out, everyone in the cyber world thought that, you know, hey, this is the most advanced piece of malware we've ever seen. Then came along Duku and eventually Flame, right? When these two came out, they basically smashed our dreams because they were even more advanced. I know some people ask me, Duku, is this like Langsat? Unfortunately, it's not. Yeah, it's DUQU, and something more advanced than Duku is Flame. And surprisingly, they somehow were all targeting Iran and Middle Eastern countries.
Money.
So, money, cyber warfare.
Alright. Now, so what exactly happened? You know, because there seems to be a lot of media hype around this.
That's true, Jeff. See, if you go on the net, you see a lot of info, and they all seem to be beating around the same bush. Yeah, they keep telling that Flame is advanced, super advanced, this. So what we decided to do was this. See, if you look at Flame, also known as Skywiper, we decided to we came back and said, look, we're gonna break this Flame down to pieces, and we did a forensic analysis on Flame, and we ripped it up apart, and we found a few interesting facts. Now, the first thing, the development of this command and control code of this Flame started off as early as December 2006. Now, remember I mentioned earlier about Operations Olympic Games and about Obama stating that, you know, it started off in 2006. He wasn't lying, but it was December 2006 to be exact. Now, the source codes indicate that there were at least 4 programmers involved, right? For the purpose of the interview, we'll call it as D, O, H, and R. Because we eventually found out their real identity as well. And the most recent source code change was actually on May 18, 2012. And this we found out from 2 specific files. One of them was constants.py, that's a Python file. And here's the best part. This particular command and control that was designed for Flame is able to handle 4 different malware. Flame's just one of it. Now, the short forms that were used in the code were called SP, SPE for enhanced, maybe, FL, which we think it's Flame, and IP. Now, it also has 3 protocols for communication. One is old protocol, one is old protocol enhanced, and sign up protocol. Now, from the 4 malware, only Flame is known, right? The other 3 are currently unknown. And for communication, Flame uses the oldest version of the protocol, which is the old protocol, right? We have found some evidence of an unknown related malware, which is we think is SPE, in the wild, but we've not been able to confirm it. We think it will surface sometime in about 4 or 5 months' time. And this is the best part. From all the 4 malwares, Flame is the least modern malware that this command and control can support. There is another more advanced malware called IP, which we have no clue where it's going to go, when it's going to go, and how. And the best part is, it's still work in progress, because when we looked at the code, it's not finished yet. There was another protocol called Red Protocol that they haven't even finished coding. So that was an interesting thing that we actually looked at. And when we traced back, we found servers that were used even in Malaysia, in Asia, in India, Germany. And there were so many domains that were registered with fake addresses that were leading to hotels and somebody's house for the domain information, so that they could use these domains for callback, so that these victims can be connected remotely. And one more interesting thing was that, when we say Flame is so advanced and all that, some of the users, or rather the listeners, might be wondering, might be imagining some kind of a super duper highly advanced command and control with things running around left, right, center, flash and all that. But they purposely made it look extremely basic. It was a white background with 2 boxes, username and password. And that's it. They made it look like it was coded by a novice, by a basic hacker, but it wasn't. Because when we went in, we found certain portion of the code that only a government could have access to it. Certain piece of cryptographic code that only a government can have access to.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And so now that we know all this, right? Are we prepared for it if it ever happens?
Sadly, a lot of nations aren't. Right? And from our personal experience, I mean, for example, in the earlier stages when we talked about, there were GhostNet, for example, in China. Immediately when we see that, we come to a conclusion that China is the one behind the attack. But wait a minute, there's so many computer users in China, for example, that doesn't have an antivirus, so they could become proxies, and we could easily be manipulated by another country that wants China to get the blame. And sadly, when we looked at a lot of our cases, we find that it was traced back to the US administration. Yeah. So.
All right. Now, in any recent cases, perhaps a variant of Flame that you've encountered.
Oh yes, we did. In August this year, we found a variant in the Dutch government in Holland, and where a couple of the public sector computers and networks were hit by a new malware, which was known as at that point it was created and called as Dorifel, right? W32.Dorifel. Now, this particular Trojan entered the networks through a variant of Zeus, which is a banking Trojan. There's a variant of Zeus which is called Citadel, and hardly about 2 weeks later, we found new variants of Dorifel in the US government installations and several other government installations as well. And here's the funny part. Dorifel, from our investigations, has been very interesting because it took something that was very old, an old technique, an old vulnerability called right to left override, RTLO, and created it with a new sexy twist, sort of like the old Mini coming back with a new look, right? And I think this is going to be a big home run for whoever who created it.
Oh, okay. Now, of course, before we end the show, you're just going to be saying about, be careful of what we share and stuff like that. But I think for this case, it's just completely different. Cause
it's completely different.
It's out of our hands,
A couple of weeks back, the US government outrightly went out to claim that Huawei, for example, is actually a Chinese government cyber spy tool. Oh. Right? So when you look at all these things, and then we hear cases of the US government doing so, and here we come back to Malaysia, and we have this mentality where anything imported is good. Bring it back to the military perspective, I think that's disaster. Especially when you have, here we go in and say anything imported is good, and we've got everything on a default installation from every other country in the world. And that's pretty much opening our heads for anything or anyone that wants to take anything from us. So when we look in that perspective, a few things that we got to look at. First of all, you need to have some kind of policy for the military so that they know which techniques to use and which techniques not to use when they're engaging in some form of cyber warfare. Now, the mindset of the military professionals also needs to be trained, because you need to now not have tough and rough men, but you also need to have high-tech computer security experts in the military, right? And of course, they need to also come up with defensive plans against all the known attacks. For example, I'm not sure if we are actually protected against Dorifel, for example, right? That's still hot off the press. And in the end, of course, for you and I, we need to increase public awareness, right? And give tips on, how to use computer safely, just like what we're doing here today.
I think, in fact, it's also like the one that you mentioned, how China users don't really have antivirus protection, so they could be using as proxies,
Yes,
So we have to be a bit more aware of, what actually do we do.
Exactly, because otherwise, next thing you know, they would say Malaysia is part of a cyber warfare attempt against some other country. Yeah.
All right, now I've been speaking to Krishna Rajagopal, the CEO of AKATI Consulting, talking about Doku, Flame, and cyber warfare. BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.